Hi, I'm Becky Johnson with Sweetheart Quilt Design Company, and today we're going to talk about how to adjust block sizes. So say you have a lap size quilt with 12-inch blocks and you like the look of it, but you need to make a baby quilt. You want to take them down to 6 inches. Or you have a quilt pattern that has 8-inch blocks and you want to make it bigger without making a lot more blocks. So you want to take those 8-inch blocks up to 12-inch blocks. So we're going to talk about that. So we'll start out with the basic, simple math of it. Okay, so in this example, we want to go from an 8-inch block to a 12-inch block. So if you divide 12 by 8, you come up with 1.5. 1 is the original 8, and the 0.5 takes us up to 12. So that's a 50% increase. So on the 8-inch block, the corners would measure 2 inches finished. So the instructions will tell you to cut them at 2.5 inches, which includes the seam allowance. So to increase those by 50%, here's the math. You start out with 2.5, subtract your seam allowance, so it's 1/4 inch on either side, so a 1/2 inch gives you the 2 inches. Then multiply times 1.5 to increase by 50%, and that gives you 3 inches. And then add back your seam allowance, it gives you 3.5. And you have to multiply by 1.5. We're increasing by 50%, but the 1 keeps this 2 here. If you just multiplied times 0.5, you'd get 1 inch, and that's obviously too small. You have to add those together. Okay, so you'd change your cut size to 3.5. Okay, so that one was easy. Here's one that's a little more complicated. Say they finish at 3.5. So the instructions will tell you to cut 4 inches. Subtract your 1/2 inch seam allowance, gives you 3.5. Multiply times 1.5, you get 5.25, and then add back your 1/2 inch. So you would cut them at 5 3/4. All right, now let's say you're making rectangles. So right up here, we have, so the instructions say cut a 2.5 by 4.5. So we've already done the math for the 2.5, and we know that's cut at 3.5. So you just have to do the math for the 4.5, and you'll come out with 6.5. Okay, so because it'll be 4 minus your 1/2 times 1.5 gives you 6 plus your 1/2. All right? Now, what if you're doing half square triangles like this? So that's called a half square triangle because each triangle is a half the square. You guys get that. So we're going to follow the same formula. It's just that the seam allowance is different. So for the half square triangle, the instructions would say cut at 3 7/8, and we need to subtract 7/8 for the seam allowance. What? So it's your 1/2 inch that you're used to, and then 3/8 inch. So this is the Quilting 101 quilt, and you can sign up for this. There's a link at the bottom, and we talk about what you add in order to do a diagonal seam. And what you have to add is 3/8 of an inch. So a 1/2 inch plus 3/8 gives you your 7/8. So you're subtracting that, you come to this 3 inches times 1.5 makes 4.5. Add back your 7/8 inch, and you'll be cutting them at 5 3/8. Okay? A little more complicated, but still not bad. Now, what if you're doing 1/4 square triangles? So this is a 1/4 square triangle. Obviously, there's 4 triangles. They each take up a 1/4. So if the instructions say to cut them at 4 1/4, then you need to take out the seam allowance. So we have a 1/2 inch plus 3/8 for the first cut and 3/8 for the second cut. So that gives us 1 1/4. So we subtract that. We have our 3 inches times 1.5 gives us 4.5 inches. Add back our 1 1/4 seam allowance. That gives us 5 3/4. And so that's what you would cut them at to make that transition from 8 to 12. Now, one of the things I wanted to caution you with when you're adjusting block sizes, not all things work well. So this is a 12-inch block, and you can see here it's divided into 3 segments. So if I wanted to take this 12-inch block and make it a 9-inch block, then I could still have 3 segments. They'd be 3 inches instead of 4 inches. If I want to take it to 10 inches, it's going to get really complicated. So before you adjust it, take the number of segments in the block and divide it into the size you want. So when you divide 10 by 3, you get 3 1/3. And our rulers are done in 8ths, not thirds. So it's very difficult. You end up having to round up, and then it gets complicated with trying to get them to fit in the spot you want. Now you could take it to 10 1/2, which would make 3 1/2-inch squares, 10 1/2-inch finish, so 11 inches unfinished. Now this one has 4 segments in it. So a 12-inch block, this one can go to, these are 3-inch squares. If you took it to 10, you'd have 2 1/2. If you took it to 8, you'd have 2 inches. You could make it 9. You'd have 2 1/4. So it's going to get a little more complicated, but it's still not bad. So stop and think about that. You're not going to want to deal with the math of taking a 12-inch block to an 11-inch block or a 7-inch block, because that's going to get pretty complicated. One time I made a quilt, and it was designed with 8-inch blocks. And half the blocks had 4 segments, and half of them had 3. So no problem with the 4-segment blocks, 8 inches, 2 inches per segment. But, and I know you can see it already, what about a 3-segment block divided into 8 inches? So you come out with these weird numbers, so you've got to at least round up to the nearest 1/8 inch. So when it was all said and done, my 3-segment blocks came out 1/4 inch bigger than the 4-segment blocks because of that rounding up. And you can't just put a ruler on and trim around it, because you'll chop off your seam allowances. So it gets very complicated. The pattern could have easily been designed with 9-inch blocks, and it would have worked fine, because it would have had 3-inch segments and 2 1/4 inch segments, and that would have worked great. It was a really good lesson I learned, though. So anyway, before you just randomly want to switch these around, just do that simple math. Take your segments, divide it into the total block size that you want, and see how it comes out. If it's a weird number, you probably don't want to go there. Anyway, have fun with it. Please like us and subscribe, and we'll talk to you next time.